Welcome back to the Thomistic Mystic, where we explore Catholic theology and mind-bending philosophies inspired by Mr. Thomas Aquinas himself. And today, we're starting off the second video in our three-part series on modern moral philosophy and why it's fundamentally broken. If you're new here, stick around. We're all about blending timeless wisdom with practical insights for your spiritual journey. Let's get started. Last video, I showed you three major problems with expressivism. The view that says murder is wrong is just expressing an attitude like, boo murder. Now, expressivists have responses to those objections, smart responses, and I'll admit, when you first hear them, they sound pretty compelling. But here's what struck me about their counter-arguments. They actually make their position worse, not better. And I'm going to show you exactly why, because when you really look at what they're saying, something fundamental doesn't add up. In fact, their position violates the very logical principles they rely on to make their arguments. Let me start by reading you something from Simon Blackburn's Ruling Passions. Ethics is a practical subject manifested in our reactions to things and the motivations we feel. Now, when I first read this, it sounded reasonable. Ethics is practical, sure. But then something occurred to me. Every other faculty we have, vision, hearing, hunger, logical reasoning, they all involve reactions too. But somehow those reactions correspond to something real in the world. But then Blackburn says this, and this is where things get interesting. If there is such a thing as ethical knowledge, it is a matter of knowing how to act, when to withdraw, whom to admire. More than anything, that anything is the case. You see what he's doing here, right? He's carving out this exception. Moral knowledge isn't about knowing that anything is true. Now, this might sound reasonable at first, but notice what Blackburn is really claiming here. Every other human faculty, whether it's vision, hearing, logical reasoning, these track objective features of reality. But when it comes to morality, suddenly, we're just manifesting reactions. Think about how bizarre this is. When you feel hungry, that points to objective fact, that your body needs nutrients. When you see red, that tracks real wavelengths of light. When you grasp that contradictions are impossible, that's recognizing logical truth. But according to Blackburn, when you feel that genocide is wrong, you're not recognizing anything true about reality. You're just expressing an attitude. But here's what bothers me about this. Why should morality be the one faculty that doesn't get to track truth? Your hunger knows that you need food. Your eyes know that there's a tree in front of you. Your mind grasps that contradictions are impossible, and that's how we know logical truths. All of these faculties recognize real features of reality. But according to Blackburn, when it comes to morality, suddenly we're just expressing attitudes. And he never really justifies this exception. He just asserts it. Why should moral reasoning be treated differently from every other form of human reasoning? But here's what's even stranger. Blackburn admits that moral reasoning behaves exactly like other truth-tracking reasoning. We change our moral views when presented with evidence. We try to be consistent. We recognize when we've made moral mistakes. We distinguish between better and worse moral arguments. All of this suggests that moral reasoning is aimed at truth, just like scientific or logical reasoning. But Blackburn says, no. It just feels that way because of evolution. At what point does a theory become so committed to avoiding the obvious conclusion that it stops being possible or plausible? Now, when you press expressivists on this faculty problem, they usually retreat to evolutionary psychology, and their story sounds compelling at first. Expressivists typically argue something like, look, our moral feelings evolved to help groups cooperate and survive. They're useful fictions that kept our ancestors alive, not truth-tracking mechanisms. And fair enough. But here's where it gets weird. Think about how our other evolved faculties actually work. Vision evolved to track real features of the environment, light and wavelengths, object boundaries, movement patterns. Sometimes you get false positives. You might jump at a shadow thinking it's a person, but here's the key. The visual system is still fundamentally aimed at something real. Shadows exist because people exist. And same thing with hunger. It evolved to track your body's real nutritional needs. You might crave junk food. That's bad for you. But hunger itself is pointing to the real fact that your body needs energy to survive. So here's the question that struck me. Why would moral emotions be the one big exception? If we feel anger at genuine injustice, why wouldn't that point to real moral facts? But here's where their evolutionary story really breaks down. If morality were really just an evolutionary trick for group cooperation, why can we say no to it so easily? Think about real evolutionary compulsions. Things like blinking when something flies at your face or feeling pain when you're injured. These are incredibly hard to ignore. Let me give you a concrete example. Try to hold your eyes open when someone unexpectedly throws something at your face. You literally can't do it. That's because the blink reflex is a real evolutionary adaptation. It bypasses your conscious control completely. Now try this. Think of the last time you told a white lie to avoid hurting someone's feelings. Was it difficult to override your moral intuition? Probably not. Try to blink when something flies at your face. Try not feeling hungry when you haven't eaten. Your body forces these responses because they are survival critical. But moral intuitions? People override them constantly. And not just psychopaths, ordinary people. They lie, they cheat, they steal, even when they don't really need to. If moral intuitions were really evolutionary survival mechanisms, they'd be as hard to ignore as blinking. But they're not. They're more like suggestions, which is exactly what we'd expect if they were pointing toward real moral truths that we can choose to follow or reject. Real evolutionary traits grab you by the throat. Moral intuitions, they make suggestions. There is a huge difference. Now here's where their evolutionary explanation gets really problematic. And this is something that reveals a deep flaw in their reasoning. If morality is really about group survival and cooperation, how do we explain our moral obligations to people who can't contribute to society? I'm talking about the severely mentally disabled, the elderly with dementia, people in vegetative states. According to cold evolutionary calculus, these people drain resources without contributing. Blackburn's response is essentially that protecting the vulnerable builds social trust and acts like social insurance because anyone could become vulnerable. Okay, but here's the problem with that response. If morality is really about group survival, why would building trust trump maximizing group fitness? Think about it from a purely evolutionary standpoint. If you are running a tribe and resources are scarce, wouldn't the group benefit more from using those resources or unproductive members? This response just pushes the problem back a step. It's essentially saying we protect the vulnerable because we value protecting the vulnerable. That's exactly what needs to be explained. And here's what really gets to me. Most people feel an immediate moral obligation to protect genuinely helpless people, even when there's no evolutionary payoff. That feeling points to something real about human dignity, not just group survival calculations. But there's an even deeper problem with their evolutionary story. If our moral sentiments really evolved for group cooperation, why do they so often conflict with what would actually be best for group survival? Throughout most of human history, slavery probably enhanced the survival prospects of the slave-owning group. Genocide eliminated competitors for resources, abandoning the disabled, freed up resources for the productive. Yet our moral intuitions rebel against all these practices, even when they might have been evolutionarily advantageous. It's almost like our moral faculties are tracking something beyond mere group survival, something like objective moral truth. But there's an even deeper problem with Blackburn's evolutionary story. And this really gets at the heart of why expressivism fails. Blackburn keeps explaining away moral reasoning by appealing to other things: logic, social coordination, evolutionary fitness. But he never explains what makes those things valuable or true. Why is logical consistency good? Blackburn might say, because it helps us survive. But why is survival good? Because we're evolved to value it. But why should we care what evolution made us value? Every explanation just pushes back the question back one step. He's building explanations on foundations he can't account for. It's like saying the house is supported by pillars and the pillars are supported by nothing. At some point, you need bedrock. But there's an even more fundamental problem here, and this is where philosophy gets really important. Blackburn tries to ground morality in logic, social coordination, and evolutionary processes, but he never asks the crucial question: what grounds those things? Think about it. If morality is grounded in logic, what makes logic objective? If it's grounded in social coordination, what makes coordination valuable? His answer to all of these questions is basically, they just are. But that's not how explanation works. Contingent things, like human societies, evolutionary processes, even logical reasoning, as it occurs in human minds, they can't just exist without explanation. But here's what I find most revealing about expressivism. Every time you corner them on one problem, they shift to a different explanation. And there is a pattern here. First, we're just doing linguistic analysis of how moral language works. When that doesn't work, actually, morality is an adaptive illusion that helped our ancestors survive. When that gets problematic, well, it's really more like a taste in music, subjective but still meaningful to us. Each move gets them further from their original clean theory and deeper into unfound claims about human psychology and evolution. They started with a simple claim about language and ended up making sweeping statements about consciousness, evolution, and the nature of reality. It's absurdity. And here's where it gets even further absurd. When they retreat to saying our moral reasoning is just an adaptive illusion, think about what they're actually claiming. We use reason to examine morality. We notice that moral thinking behaves like other truth-tracking faculties. It responds to evidence. It can be corrected. It aims at consistency. And then, at that exact moment, the evidence points toward moral realism. They say, but that feeling of truth tracking is itself the illusion. It's like saying gravity is real until you start to understand it. Then it becomes fake. At what point does a theory become so desperate to avoid the obvious conclusion that it stops being plausible? Here's where Blackburn's position completely collapses. And this is the most important point in this entire video, so listen carefully. Blackburn appeals to logic constantly. He uses the law of non-contradiction. He demands consistency. He follows rules of inference. But here's the question he can't answer. What grounds logic itself? Why should we care about consistency? And this isn't just some abstract philosophical nitpicking. The law of logic tells us exactly what kind of foundation we need. The law of contradiction says something cannot both be and not be at the same time, and in the same respect. But notice what this implies. If logical laws are objective, and Blackburn has to assume they are to make any argument, then they can't be grounded in contingent things like human psychology or evolution. Why? Because human psychology could have been different. Evolution could have gone differently. But logical truths can't be different. So logic itself points beyond contingent reality to something necessary. The laws of logic demand a necessary foundation. And here's the crucial point. Even if expressivists try to ground morality in logic, they still haven't explained what grounds logic itself. They're missing the most fundamental step. Watch what happens when you press Blackburn on this. Why should we follow logical laws? Because they help us think clearly. Why should we think clearly? Because it helps us survive. Why should we survive? Because evolution made us value survival. Why should we care what evolution made us value? At every step, he's explaining one contingent thing by appealing to another contingent thing. It's contingency all the way down. But the laws of logic themselves tell us this can't work. You can't have an infinite chain of contingent explanations. Logic demands a necessary stopping point. Contingent things, like human societies, evolutionary processes, even logical reasoning as it occurs in human minds, they can't just exist without explanation. It's like building a house on quicksand, then building another house on that house, and claiming you've solved the foundation problem. Now, this foundational problem isn't new. 800 years ago, a philosopher named Thomas Aquinas was wrestling with these exact same questions. And before you think, why should I care about some medieval religious thinker? Remember, Aquinas' logical framework is still studied by atheist philosophers today because it's that rigorous, it's that juicy, it's that good. The reason is simple. Aquinas understood something that modern philosophers like Blackburn seem to have forgotten. You want to explain contingent things, things that depend on something else for their existence, you eventually need something necessary. And that applies to everything Blackburn appeals to. Logic, social coordination, evolution, human psychology. These are all contingent. They exist, but they don't have to exist. Aquinas realized that contingent things can't explain themselves. They require a necessary foundation, something that exists by its very nature and doesn't depend on anything else. Let me give you an analogy that makes this crystal clear. Think about mathematical truths, like the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. That truth doesn't depend on human brains or evolution or social conventions. Even if every human disappeared tomorrow, 2 + 2 would still equal 4. Mathematical truths require some kind of eternal logical structure, what mathematicians sometimes call the mathematical universe. It's something that we discover rather than something we invent. Something that makes those truths true. Aquinas realized that all truth, logical, mathematical, moral, requires the same kind of eternal foundation. And that foundation is what we call God. Not a big person in the sky, but the necessary being that grounds all contingent reality. This is exactly what Aquinas understood. In the Summa Theologia, he shows that the laws of logic themselves point to their necessary foundation. As he puts it, in the third way, we find in nature the things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt. And consequently, they are possible to be and not to be. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. This all men speak of as God. When Aquinas says truth resides primarily in the intellect and secondarily in things according as they are, related to the intellect as their principle, he's not making a religious assertion. He's following where logic itself leads. If logical truths are objective and necessary, they require a necessary intellect as their foundation. This isn't God of the gaps reasoning. This is logic demanding its own foundation and finding it in the divine intellect. And this is where it gets really powerful. In the Summa Theologia, first part of the second part, question 91, Aquinas explains, the eternal law is nothing other than the type of divine wisdom as directing all actions and movements. So when we recognize logical principles or moral truths, we're not just expressing attitudes or following social conventions. We're participating in eternal law, the divine intellect's rational ordering of reality. This solves every foundation problem we've identified with Blackburn's approach. When Blackburn asks what grounds logic or what makes survival good, we have an answer. They're all grounded in and participate in the necessary being who is pure act. God as the source of all being and truth. So here's the fundamental difference between our positions. Blackburn's expressivism, moral reasoning, is grounded in social coordination, which is grounded in evolution, which is grounded in physical laws, which are grounded in nothing. The foundation is empty. Moral reasoning participates in eternal law, which is grounded in the divine intellect, which is necessary being, pure act that requires no further explanation because it exists by its very nature. One position follows logic to its necessary conclusion, the other stops arbitrarily when the implications become inconvenient. But what if the simpler explanation is true? What if moral reasoning works because there are moral truths to discover? What if when you feel that immediate recognition that genuine injustice is wrong, you are not just expressing an attitude, you are recognizing something real about the moral structure of reality? The classical tradition doesn't have the foundation problem because it grounds everything. Logic, morality, existence itself, and a necessary foundation that doesn't require external explanation. This isn't about inserting God as a convenient explanation. It's about following the logical requirement that contingent realities must have a necessary ground. Even atheist philosophers acknowledge this as a serious philosophical position, even if they disagree with it. It's the difference between Blackburn's house built on shifting sand versus the classical foundation built on bedrock. So here's what we've seen. Expressivism can only defend itself by making increasingly desperate moves. Think about the contrast here. One position uses the laws of logic to demonstrate why moral truth must be grounded in something necessary. The other makes what amounts to a fairy tale guess, a shot in the dark about evolution and attitudes. And yet somehow many people think the fairy tale has more logical backing. The irony in that is deeply troubling. They have to deny that moral reasoning works like other reasoning. They have to claim evolution made us systematically wrong about the one domain where we most need to be right. They have to say that the very experience of moral truth is an illusion, while simultaneously borrowing from moral concepts to explain why their illusion is useful. Most fundamentally, they have to violate the very logical principles they rely on by building infinite chains of contingent explanations with no necessary foundation. But what if the simpler explanation were true? Is true? What if moral reasoning works because there are moral truths to discover? What if when you feel that immediate recognition that genuine injustice is wrong, you are not just expressing an attitude, you are recognizing something real about the moral structure of reality? Next time, I want to show you what this means for everything, how taking moral truth seriously changes how we think about progress, relationships, and even AI ethics. Because here's what's really fascinating. If Aquinas is right about moral truth having this eternal foundation, it completely transforms how we approach modern problems. Why can we say that slavery was always wrong, even when entire societies practiced it? Why do we think moral progress is possible? Why should we program AI systems with objective ethical constraints rather than just cultural preferences? All of these questions, which are absolutely crucial for how we live today, only make sense if moral truth is real and objective. In this next video, I'll show you how this 800-year-old insight from Aquinas provides the foundation for human rights, explains why moral progress isn't just cultural change, and even gives us a framework for AI ethics that expressivism simply cannot provide. But here's what you should take away right now. When someone tells you that morality is just evolution or just social coordination, ask them what grounds those things. Ask them why moral reasoning should be treated as fundamentally different from every other form of human reasoning. And ask them why the laws of logic themselves, which they use to make their arguments, don't point toward a necessary foundation. Because if they can't give you a good answer to those questions, and I don't think they can, then maybe it's time to consider that moral truth is exactly what it feels like: truth. What do you think? Are you convinced that moral reasoning tracks truth? Or do you still think it's attitudes all the way down? Let me know in the comments. Next time, we'll see why this debate isn't just academic. It's the key to understanding human dignity, moral progress, and the future of AI ethics. Until then, keep wrestling with the big questions. God bless all of you and your families. Have a wonderful weekend.